Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. As it says on my slide, I'm going to talk about airborne transmission of COVID and some links to indoor air quality. So if I can have the first slide, next slide, please. So this goes back into the middle of the 19th century when there was interest in how disease spread. The original theory was about miasma, so-called bad air, causing diseases. And I think the first major breakthrough was the cholera outbreak in Soho in London in 1854, when John Snow mapped the cases and realized that they were located around a water pump in Broad Street, and when they stopped the flow from this pump, the outbreak stopped, which gave the first indication that disease like cholera in that case is waterborne. Next slide, please. So around the same time, of course, there was a lot of interest in health in hospitals. I quite like this quote from Florence Nightingale, which I think is still appropriate today, that the first requirement in a hospital is it should do you no harm. And she placed an emphasis on things that we would associate with good indoor air quality, high ceilings, ventilation, spacing of beds. She's also very interesting in terms of pioneering statistical methods for understanding disease spread. And this is her famous Nightingale Rose diagram on the right, which documents the diseases and causes of death during the Crimea War, for which she was, of course, famously associated with. Next slide, please. Airborne transmission itself was first suspected for tuberculosis, and in 1934, Wells, pictured here in the picture, in the top picture on the right, suggested that there were droplet nuclei expelled from breath. And in a study, Riley, also pictured in that photograph with Wells, looked at guinea pigs which were separated but had air extracted over them, which carried through infected tuberculosis guinea pigs. And they showed definitely that tuberculosis was airborne. So this is, I think, the first clear indication that these diseases can spread through the air. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk a bit about is what we've been doing recently on schools. This is an area obviously of great social concern, with schools reopened after the summer, and of course with the oncoming onset of winter. We're still very concerned with schools. So how can you estimate the risk in schools and what are the effects of or the changes of the seasons? So the next slide, please. So the way one assesses the risk of airborne infection is through this equation. And if you can press the next slide, please. It shows here that so the probability of infection is given by this expression at the top, and the things to notice are the things that occur in the exponential form. So Q, the quanta, is really how much infectious airborne material is released by someone. This, of course, is very unclear in many circumstances. It varies with disease, it varies with activity levels, and we don't have an independent way of assessing that. It depends on the number of infected people, the rate at which you breathe, the exposure time. So the longer you're exposed, the larger the probability of infection. And finally, the room ventilation rate, which of course for air pollution and indoor air quality is an important ingredient. It's actually very hard to determine that. And if you have the next slide, please. Ruddock and Milton in 2003 produced an alternative expression for this. So it contains, again, the number of infected people and the amount, the quanta generation rate and the exposure time. But now it replaces the ventilation rate with the rebreathed fraction. So this is the amount of air that has been breathed out by some other person in the space, divided by the number of occupants. So this takes away the need to actually calculate the room ventilation rate and simply need to calculate the rebreathed fraction. So the next slide, please. And you can see here at the top right that this is related to the level of carbon dioxide. Obviously, levels of carbon dioxide certainly in a classroom setting above the background ambient are almost all associated with of exhaled breath from pupils and other teachers and staff. And so by measuring CO2, you can get a measure of how much of the air that you're breathing in has been breathed out by someone else. And you can see here, we have lots of measurements from a range of schools across the UK. These are spread over 3 years, summer and winter, so June and January. And you can see that levels can be quite high, 2,000 parts per million. The background level is about 400 and something, so that's 5 times background. You feel quite drowsy when you're in air of 2,000 parts per million. So that would indicate high probability of infection in those situations. We'll look into this in a bit more detail in the next slide. So again, we can now do this slightly differently because, as I said, one of the things that matters is your exposure time. And of course, if you're with the same people every day, then you're exposed to them in a cumulative fashion. So if you're exposed to them on Monday and then again on Tuesday, and there's an affected person present the whole time, the exposure is the same as if there had been no gap in the night, essentially. So instead of just having time here, we integrate over the time that you're in presence. And so for this particular calculation, we've imagined a school week, 5 days from 9 till 3:30, 4 o'clock. And we've guessed an estimate for this quanta generation rate of 1 per hour, which is based on some recent work, which suggests that people are basically sitting still in classrooms. That may be a bit optimistic, perhaps, but relatively sedentary activity. And the next slide, please. So this shows an example of carbon dioxide levels in a classroom over a week, and it shows the characteristic picture of people entering the classroom in the morning, a sharp rise in CO2, as you can see, various peaks and troughs which are associated with breaks and lunchtime. And then at the end of the day, a slow decay as everybody leaves and the building settles back to the ambient level, and then it repeats on the following weekday. And what we show here is the difference between January on the left and July on the right. You can see that levels in January in this classroom are much higher. The orange is the daily average than in the summer in July. This, of course, is because windows are open in the summer, much less in the winter. And this seasonal variation is important. So next slide, please. And from this, we can calculate the probability of infection in a given classroom. And as I said, it's cumulative. So every day that you're there over the 5 days, and then it's flat overnight and carries on. And again, you can see a significant higher probability in January than in July. And the next slide, please. So can I just go back, actually? Sorry. Go back a slide. Yeah, so this shows that there's a significant variation in the seasons. And of course, this is why we are very concerned about winter, and we've got a second winter coming up right now. And so trying to alleviate these effects are very important in this process. Next slide, please. And it's a complicated picture. So this is the variations in carbon dioxide levels. This is the average. These are the average numbers of infections that come about from carbon dioxide levels in each classroom in a given school. So this is the same building within a school, the same ventilation system, and we see quite a lot of variation from one classroom to another based on the local CO2 measurements. And again, you can see on the left the January figures, and on the right the July figures. showing that, again, there's a big seasonal variation. Secondary infection is much higher in the winter than it is in the summer. Next slide, please. Again, we've done this for all of the 45 classrooms that we've looked at over the period from November 2015 to March 2020. So these are quite a large number of statistics. And again, you can see that over the months, so this goes from over the school year, you can see the peak in the middle months. On the left is the absolute number of infections, and on the right, the relative risk. And you can see that again, it's highest in the January, February months when the classrooms are much more sealed and the ventilation rates are lower. And this is just based on carbon dioxide measurements. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, yes, and I should say that you can find the details of this in a recent publication that is listed here. Next slide, please. So this is all based on the idea that you take a measurement of CO2 in a classroom, but of course the question then is, how representative is that measurement, given that you have perhaps a complicated space, children distributed in different ways. And just to show you an example, I'll show you some work that we did on a building in London. This is a naturally ventilated office. You can see it's on the second floor, outlined in red on the top right. The plan view of the building is on the left. And we had CO2 sensors where the green dots are, placed both at different locations spatially, but also at different heights within the space. And this is an office occupied by up to 8 people, with 2 windows on the front, as you can see at the top picture, and 1 window at the back. So there's various ventilation options that are available by opening different combinations of windows. I don't want to discuss that, but I'll just show you some of the data. So the next slide, please, shows the CO2 levels. So the top graph shows the CO2 over a course of a day. The second one shows the number of people. So you can see that as occupants to the office arrive, as expected, the CO2 levels rise. And as the numbers fluctuate, the CO2 levels fluctuate. And you can see from the bottom panel that they open a window only in the afternoon, and you can see a significant drop in the CO2 levels, as you'd expect when you open a window. But the other thing to notice about this is that, all of that's expected, is that there's quite a lot of variation between sensors within the room. So getting a representative measure of the CO2, it can be quite difficult. So for example, when the window is open, the purple value drops almost to ambient because that sensor is right by the window, whereas some of the others are still twice the ambient value. So there's a lot of spatial variability. And if we go to the next slide, this is somewhat associated with the temperature variations within the room. So again, the temperature follows a similar pattern. People arrive in the morning and they give off heat, the temperature rises, it falls at lunchtime, it falls again when they open the window and then when they leave. But again, you can see some variation in the temperature from the floor at 22 centimeters, the bottom curve, to nearly 2 meters at the top. So as you expect, warm air is near the ceiling, cold air is near the floor, and that has a big implication. So if we look at CO2 in the next slide, you'll see that similar things are found with carbon dioxide. So the measurement in black in the left chart shows the low values, whereas the one near the ceiling in blue, which is always higher than the ones at the floor. So carbon dioxide levels are always higher in this office, shouldn't generalize, in this office are significantly higher near the ceiling than they are near the floor, even though carbon dioxide is heavier than air. That's because it's carried up, your breath is carried up because it's warm and you are also giving off heat, so it accumulates at the ceiling. So what goes on in these spaces, and that of course affects how pollutants move around, is a complicated interaction of heat given off by people, flow through windows and so on. And so while we're able to make some estimates based on a single measurement of CO2, we should be aware that there can be, significant variations, and it's a complex problem in many respects. And so I think my final slide is next. So what I want to just say is that CO2 provides an indication of how well a space is ventilated, how little or how much of the air that is in the room has already been breathed out by the occupants. And of course, this is important, as you will be aware, that the government is planning to roll out CO2 sensors to all schools in the UK over the next few months. It's also tried to show that it can be quite a complex system indoors, and so you need to think about where you're going to place them. If you're a school teacher, you might wonder what you're going to do when you see a value and what will happen when a window opens. And I think that's an area that is of great interest at the moment. And finally, just to reiterate the point that winter poses a real hazard compared to the summer, because we tend to ventilate less. And I'd like to thank my collaborators on this work, Catherine Oakes from Leeds, Megan Davies-Wykes from Cambridge and Shiwei Fan, and Henry Burridge and Caroline Voiro from Imperial. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. That was incredibly insightful and a useful introduction to the subject. And it clearly shows the complexity and the number of variables that we are dealing with, and probably one of the challenges for policymakers for buildings, new buildings and existing building stock, and how we manage indoor air quality going forward. Just one question really at the moment, just to start off the issue, is how do we go about communicating this complexity to the users, the head teachers, the building managers, to try and get them to start to understand some of the models and information that you've gained through your studies, and how that can manage better air quality for users of those buildings?
Well, I think it's a very good question, and we're in fact in the process of working with the Cabinet Office to try and produce some explanatory videos to demonstrate some of these features. Obviously, in terms of operating spaces both in your home and in the workplace, no one expects occupants to understand and deal with all the nuances here. Simply, we want to try and provide the best straightforward advice we can. But I just think it's good to be aware that not one size will fit all, probably.
And just another question on, have you seen any difference in, for example, urban settings where there's kind of ambient air pollution potentially coming into the building versus a rural location where maybe air quality outside is better in filtering inside?
Yeah, not in this context. No, I mean it's clearly. I mean you clearly see that in terms of PM and such like, but not in the context that we're discussing here. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm just going to check on the chat to make sure there's no other questions. Just on here, if there's any questions, if anyone wishes to raise issue. Peter Fleming's raised an issue on the chat about useful webinars on this issue, and about the low-cost way of reducing COVID in enclosed spaces with airborne transmission. And I think that's one of the areas of real concern that both education establishments and hospitals have related to the issues of indoor air quality and pollution and infection, and just getting better learnings. And I think the issue of COVID has certainly highlighted that and raised it up the political agenda for all types of stakeholders that are interested in this area. And I think the work that you're doing around CO2 knowledge and understanding is crucial. But I think there's how that is communicated down to the head teachers, the building managers, the county policy education establishments is going to be real challenging, because at the moment the government's agenda is very much to try and reduce heat loss, through sustainable buildings, air tightness. And here we are saying, actually, no, let's open up the window and let air flow through the building. So I don't know if you'd have any comments around that in terms of those challenges between sustainability and kind of what I call eco homes and the sustainability energy agenda versus the health aspects of air quality.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question, of course, and it's an area which I think we're just beginning to grapple with, and maybe it's become even more critical just in the last week or two with the huge increase in gas prices. The idea of telling people to open their windows this coming winter when their gas bills are going to be high may not be a very palatable message to put across. But I do think that there are strategies that can be employed to minimize the energy loss at the same time trying to maintain ventilation. So, for example, if you're thinking about the domestic situation, clearly the biggest risk for additional transmission is if you have visitors in your home. Rather than just the people who normally live there, because I think people who normally live there, if they have it, you'll probably catch it, and if they don't, you won't. But it's when you bring other people in, so maybe you take extra effort over the time they're with you, but not so much otherwise. And one has to think a bit more carefully about how you square this circle. It's not straightforward, I would say.
And just one final question, Paul. You mentioned right at the end of the presentation about the government's proposals for indoor air quality monitoring in schools, all schools. It's been a little bit controversial from what I've heard in terms of the way it was, the contracts being presented. And I don't know if you're aware of all that, but I'm just interested in your knowledge or thoughts about some of the challenges that the government may be having in delivering that program, and also whether you're aware of any of the data that's going to be collected from that and how that will feed into academia and knowledge of this space, because to me it's a massive opportunity to really get massive learning around air quality and movement of air in buildings and these monitors. But I'm not sure if the data is going to be collected across all these schools or whether it's just going to be done at a local level, or whether you have any knowledge around that. Your thoughts on that?
I don't know much about procurement, but I do know that the monitors that are being placed in schools will not collect data. It simply will give a readout of the CO2 measure. So I agree with you that there's a huge opportunity here to do something on a different scale. In fact, I have a project associated with schools, and we're in discussion with the DFE at the moment about trying to have additional monitors placed in a large number of schools, so we can do exactly what you just said. But that's it's early days. But I agree, it would be a huge opportunity to do all sorts of interesting things.